Okay, I think I'm going to make a start. So, welcome to today's Lunch and Learn session, Confidentiality Matters. For the next hour, we will be delving into the important issue of protecting whistleblowers' identity within internal whistleblowing arrangements. The complexity of this topic was the motivation for us to create a guide for employers covering this topic, which I'll go into in a bit more detail in a minute. But we didn't create this guide alone. We had held roundtables and research sessions with employers, whistleblowers, and lawyers covering this subject. And we've created a guide based on the findings from those two roundtables, which we are proud to launch at this webinar. But before I sort of go into details about the guide itself, I also want to introduce our brilliant panel of experts who will help us navigate through the complex area of confidentiality and whistleblowing. First, a couple of housekeeping matters first. Today's event will be recorded. You should have had a message that came up as you logged into the session. And we will have time at the end of the session, so about 20 minutes for questions to be asked of the speakers. I just ask that people use the question and answer function on Zoom to ask those questions so that we can feed them to the panels and panel members they can see. There's also a chat feature which you can use during the presentation. Yeah, the Q&A function would be the best way to kind of ask questions of the panel members. So I'm going to move quickly. So the structure of today will be I'll run through what's in the guide very quickly before we get to a conversation around confidentiality with our various panel members, who I will now introduce. So first panel member is, and you probably would have seen Andy speak many times on whistleblowing, on various whistleblowing webinars. It's Andy Noble, who's head of whistleblowing and Speak Up for the NatWest Group. He started his career with NatWest in 1984, and he's held numerous frontline positions in risk and has predominantly worked in retail and private bank sectors. His experience spans compliance, operational risk, credit risk, and financial crime. And following the introduction of new whistleblowing regulations in the UK in 2016, Andy led the development and implementation of group-wide whistleblowing arrangements at NatWest, formerly Royal Bank of Scotland. This provides a mechanism for colleagues across the bank to confidentially raise concerns about unethical behaviour and wrongdoing, helping to support a strong risk culture. We also, on our panel today, is Tina Russell, who is a HR professional and chartered member of CIPD. She is an independent ethics and consultant. She's worked in professional bodies and regulator sector for 20 years and been responsible for dealing with complaints that include whistleblowing employment disputes for even longer. She worked for CIPD for 15 years and developed their ethics in the workplace guide, as well as their latest code of conduct and ethics, both of which include provisions on whistleblowing and speak up in the workplace. And finally, we have Tim Smith from Safecall, and he is their operations director, and he leads on their investigation and training offering. He has been at Safecall since 2016 as operational manager in his current position for the last 4 years. Having started his work life as a quality control engineer in a local factory, he subsequently joined Northumbria Police and served for 30 years, achieving the rank of superintendent. He worked in a variety of roles, primarily in Sunderland and Gateshead area commands, as well as long spells in operational support. Now, before I move on to the guide, I just want to point out that we were unable to secure a whistleblower to speak on the panel, given the subject matter. But again, I just want to emphasize that whistleblowers' voices were included in the creation of the guide that I'm about to speak about right from its inception and creation. So I will now speak about, I'm going to run through the guide that we have published. Let me just, so last month we published a guide on confidentiality produced by Protect. As I said, this was a production of 2 years' work, really, and the center of it was a roundtable with whistleblowers, lawyers, and employers talking about the challenges that organizations face around protecting the identity of whistleblowers and best practice in terms of how to produce systems that can protect those individuals that came forward. And the motivation for producing this guide was that I think confidentiality, protecting individuals who come through the system is the chief way really that employers can protect whistleblowers from victimization from within the organization. And it's become really the sort of default way in many ways for concerns to be raised. And the guide really delved through that sort of anxiety that employers have around creating a system that both offers that protection reassurance, but does so in a way that doesn't overpromise or kind of tramples on the rights of other people. And so just to emphasize the importance of this particular issue, we know from research that we've done with YouGov that UK workers, 32% of UK workers identify reprisals as a key barrier for raising concerns. So getting the kind of messaging and the infrastructure around confidentiality is really key. And so this guide is following on from our preventive victimization guide, which we held, which we launched 2 years ago, is really the attempt to sort of delve into various difficult subjects that employers might face around whistleblowing systems. Because there's quite a lot of guides out there that do deal with the system in its entirety. This is an attempt to look at specific issues that employers will face. So what's in the guide? So the guide is a paid product from Protect, and I'll give information in a minute how you can access that guide. But really the guide covers sort of various different areas. It was created with input from experts, not just Protect. So this is not just Protect's view of confidentiality, it also provides other people's perspectives from whistleblowers, employers, those that run whistleblowing systems, those people who take or defend cases through the tribunal system. We also then deep dive into best practice through 4 case studies. So we're really showcasing best practice around creating systems that protect whistleblowers' identity, how that can be fed into sort of triage investigation processes and sort of breaches as well, where that might occur. So really this is based on innovative practice, things that employers are putting in place as we speak within their workplace. We also the guide will also outline key messages to reassure staff. So whether that's through the whistleblowing policy itself, key pieces of communication to staff about the whistleblowing system so staff can feel reassured that the processes are robust if they're used. We also provided a step-by-step guide on how to protect confidentiality from triage to investigation to the conclusion of whistleblowing cases. So again, there's that kind of step-by-step sort of process that people can look at through the guide. We also provide a practical overview of the legal issues around confidentiality and whistleblowing. So this is not a replacement of legal advice. It's not a legal textbook. It's not something that provides commentary really on the legal cases, but comes at it really from a practical point of view so that there is a kind of overview of the legal principles and also around data protection as well. So to give that kind of practical idea. And finally, it outlines how employees should respond to breaches of confidentiality, whether that's where the whistleblower maybe have breached their own confidentiality, how to respond to that, where managers have done that, or whether that's come up through an investigation, and how to learn from those breaches. So how to fold those learnings into a general review, maybe at board level, of the whistleblowing arrangements overall. So that gives you an idea of the guide itself. This last slide is how to purchase the guide itself. There's a QR code here. The guide will cost £99. There's details on our website. So this is a paid product. It will feed into, well, you might want to think of it as like a paid product for employers to use, but it would also feed into the operations of Protect in terms of the advice and support that we offer whistleblowers and the sort of the campaigning aspects that we do and the research. So that's the main presentation of the what's in the guide itself. Now we're going to move on to the discussion with the panel members, and I'm going to turn to Andy Noble first. And I have a question for you, Andy, which is, as someone who leads whistleblowing arrangements for NatWest, what are the biggest challenges in protecting the whistleblower's identity?
Yeah, thanks, Andy, and hello, everybody. So I could probably take up the whole hour with talking about challenges. So I'll keep it to three or four points, really. The first one is about educating colleagues on what to do if they receive a concern and what to do if they want to report a concern. So it's all very well having a really good framework and a really good policy if people don't understand it and therefore won't use it. So one of the things that we need to do is make sure that we educate the staff. So there's a case for obviously general education points. So we run an annual e-learning module on what we call a Speak Up, which is our whistleblowing service. But we've also undertaken to do targeted training. So and this targeted training population has grown. It now covers obviously line managers get a specific section on their e-learning module about what to do if they receive a concern, but we've also been targeted training on people that operate the framework, such as obviously my team, people in other areas that support the framework, such as investigations, HR consultants, and we even do specific training on populations such as the EA and business executive assistants and business managers, because they could be in receipt of whistleblowing concerns. In fact, they might be one of the first people to receive a whistleblowing concern, and it might not always be appropriate for them to discuss that with the person that they're supporting, depending on the nature of it. So it's about educating people about where to raise these concerns and what to do with them. So that's quite a big challenge. We've obviously got sort of over 60,000 staff, so that is a big piece of work for us to do. Second one is encouraging colleagues when they want to raise concerns to understand what the various routes are available to them, and preferably not do it through sometimes we see general email with lots and lots of recipients with somebody raising a concern, and that can be very difficult to manage because obviously we've got the confidentiality issue there, but we've also got the issue of making sure that it gets dealt with by one person in the right way. Otherwise, you can see there's lots of different people trying to get involved in a case, which obviously we don't want for lots of very good reasons. So getting people to understand the service, be confident in using the service is really important for us. And really pleased to say that we've doing a staff survey every year, and 97% of staff said that they know how to raise concerns about wrongdoing or misconduct. So that's taken a while for us to get here. So that's good for me. And then number 3 would be identifying potential issues or red flags at an early stage. And I know that in the guide there is a risk assessment template. I would strongly encourage all firms to have a risk assessment process in place at triage, because it's at that stage where you're assessing the concern when they come in. You can look for red flags. Confidentiality is one of them, obviously, but there are other red flags that means that you might need to think about different ways in which to manage that investigation. So the obvious things would be such the reporter's identity is going to be clear when you start investigating. Even if they have said that they're anonymous, it's going to be obvious who they are. Reporter has raised concerns before or openly with colleagues, line managers, and reporter is anxious or worried, and therefore perhaps their behaviours change in the workplace. So all of these kind of good red flags will help you to manage that investigation appropriately. And then I guess the final one is one of the challenges is obviously going to disciplinary process. So at that point, it's protecting the identity of the whistleblower, trying to work out whether or not you actually do need their evidence in terms of the findings, or whether you've managed to gain other evidence. So it means that's not a key part of your package, your disciplinary package, if you like. So there are probably 4 main ones for me, but as I say, there are a lot more, but they're the ones that come to mind straight away.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andy. That's comprehensive, and I really should have mentioned the risk assessment that's in the guide in my presentation. So thank you for.
That's right. I've got you back, Andy. It's fine.
Tim or Tina, do you want to come in and comment on this, on what Andy said, or add to, or disagree?
Yeah. Yeah, do you mind, shall I jump in first, Tim? Sorry, yeah, thank you. Just want to reinforce that point about the education and training, and that this needs to be something that's done on a regular basis rather than just when people join an organisation. So often I see that it's part of the induction and onboarding process, but that's the only point that the policy and the system in place is actually flagged up. And then the other thing is in terms of identifying those red flags, it's obviously something that should be done both with those that are dealing with the reports that are being made, but actually any governance of the process afterwards. So evaluation at board level, exec level, in terms of trends and patterns that are being identified. And, something that I always flag up when I do get the opportunities, the triangulation of other sources of evidence, such as exit interviews, that sort of thing. So I would just add those points.
Thank you. That's really helpful, Tina.
Andy, I would just, through our experience of speaking to whistleblowers regularly, obviously it's what we do for a living, there's quite often a mix-up in people's minds between confidentiality and anonymity.
Yeah.
And people do regularly get them mixed up. So you always need to be clear, I think, in managing the whistleblower's expectation around that difference, that very distinct difference between and purely, completely anonymous submission, or alternatively, a submission that can be dealt with confidentially, and the two very different beasts. And I think we always need to bear that in mind when speaking to whistleblowers. For those of us who are immersed in that world, is that we may understand all of that, but we need to be very clear that the people who are reporting to us understand that very, very distinct difference between anonymity and confidentiality. And I'd also touch on the triage angle, which is, this is obviously like front and center at the start of the process. And probably the first thing you have to do is decide whether because speak up programs will attract lots more issues raised than those which fall under statutory obligations and guidance. And it's important at that early stage to separate those two out, because part of managing the whistleblower is to make sure that obviously that they're not going to suffer any detriment. And as senior people in organisations, we're all vicariously liable for ensuring that happens. And it's a different process altogether if you're a company that's operating on one site, as opposed to Andy, who's looking after people working on hundreds and hundreds of sites. What can you realistically put in place to safeguard that whistleblower?
Yeah, thank you very much. Before I move on to the next question, I'm just going to fire off a poll that we've put together, just which shouldn't take too long to launch. So we have 3 questions. And I should have launched this during my presentation, so apologies. But if people can fill that out, and then I'll move on to the next question on my script. Just going to leave a couple more minutes. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now. Thank you very much for everybody that took part. Tim, what evidence do you have running your service at Safecall about whistleblowers' preferences for confidential or anonymous reporting options?
I'll just quickly reference, if you go to the Safecall website, every year we publish a benchmarking report, as other similar organisations like ourselves do, and it's there freely available for anybody who wants to have a look at it. But some of the highlights from that would be that two basic ways usually to input into a whistleblowing system run by somebody external to your company. That's digitally, usually via a web portal or via a telephone. And we get very, very different results from both channels. So, for example, if people report via the web, then they're substantially more likely to be anonymous than to be happy to be named. In fact, that rate is currently standing at around 70% of all submissions made via the internet are anonymous. That contrasts with reports that are received via the telephone, where only 45% are anonymous. And that kind of reflects 2 points, I think. One, on a very direct human interaction, such as the telephone, you can explain far more about what a process looks like and how people will be safeguarded than you can do through a straightforward digital submission. And the second main point is obviously, and it was touched on earlier on, around if things were to develop into disciplines or ETs or whatever, then obviously a witness has greater standing and integrity if they are named and are able to put their own evidence forward than if it's on an anonymous basis. So that's the kind of split that occurs there. There's some other interesting kind of little nuances within that. What we find generally is that people are more likely to make it two reasons: more likely to make a digital report where it's on a more transactional basis. Like I said earlier on, speak up lines catch a whole lot more than pure public interest type whistleblowing reports. So if it's a very transactional thing, such as I've been moved or I haven't been paid what I'm due and other things, that's far more likely to come through the web. If it's a more emotional, personal issue where somebody's been bullied, harassed, that's far more likely to come through on a telephone line, where whistleblowers have the option to do that. And we know from speaking with clients that you have a far greater chance of having a substantiated outcome, 11% greater, whether the input method is via the telephone. So that there's a clear advantage to that. But conversely, and other people may have caught this last week, I was listening to a podcast last week where people under 20, I think it was people under 25, I think, don't answer their telephones. They screen everything because they want to be very careful about their response. And obviously they're from an age where digital means of doing virtually everything is much on the increase compared to older folk. Andy, I'm going to include you in this because I know you've been at work a long time. It's than we would have been, for example. And we have seen a significant shift in the reporting means. If I'd sat on this webinar certainly 7 or 8 years ago, I'd have been telling you that we got 2/3 of our reports via the telephone and 1/3 via the internet, via the web. That's completely inverted now and turned on its head. It's 1/3 over the telephone, and the overwhelming majority now come through the web. People are far more comfortable. People are far more technically able than was previously. And the channel's that much more easier to access now than it would have been previously. As COVID hit, anonymity rates went up. So we all went to work from home. The majority of those who could ended up working from home. and we did see probably a 5 to 10% shift to reporters wanting to be anonymous, and that hasn't dropped back. So that's kind of stayed where it was, where, you know, most people will have been filtering back into work 2022-ish. That anonymity rate stayed up there. Interestingly as well, we mentioned earlier on regarding why people want to be anonymous. We ask that question, whether it's digital input or whether it's on the telephone. And to support what was said previously, it is overwhelmingly fear of reprisals. We always try and find out what that fear of reprisal is if we're speaking to somebody, and that's not always well articulated. It's usually just a kind of general cultural sense that this wouldn't be well received, and I'd be putting myself in some sort of jeopardy.
Thank you very much, Tim. Yeah, that's interesting to see that kind of inversion. Andy, do you have any reflections on that particular point around the sort of change in nature of how concerns are raised, or whether there's, you know, particular issues that are more suited to being raised sort of via web form or online as opposed to like on the telephone?
Yeah, and I'd echo what Tim says actually. So when I first started the framework in 2016, we had a far higher number of people using telephony to raise their concerns, for sure. And that we have seen exactly the same trend is going the other way now. And far more people are raising concerns via sort of our web reporting system. So in terms of then the mix, I mean, I haven't done the analysis, but our mix hasn't really changed massively. So I would say that the mix hasn't necessarily changed, but it's the way that people report their concerns definitely has changed, and their demand for better sort of IT is definitely there as well. So, you know, mobile reporting, you know, not just do it through the web. So there is definitely an increase in flexibility.
Great.
Yeah, Andy, just on the back of that, what I would suggest tentatively, and I don't have any real stats or anything to back this up, but I would suggest that if you are receiving more named reports than anonymous reports, then it speaks to the culture of the organisation. And, you know, through various agencies, you can benchmark the types of reports and what reporting origins you can get. But I think that's a really useful guide. If you've got a good percentage of people who are satisfied to be named, they're clearly comfortable with the situation and with the culture of the organisation, I think it's a real good kind of thermometer for an organisation.
Yeah, certainly our advice to employers when they're sort of benchmarking or reviewing their whistleblowing arrangements, that's something to pick up on, is that level of sort of anonymous concerns, that kind of thing. Or, like I said, being named or openly raised concerns can be really clear, a good indicator of the culture that exists. So, Tina, I'm going to move on to a question. Just want to ask, do you have any tips, Tina, for employers on how to manage a whistleblower's expectations? And are there key points they need to bear in mind when managing that relationship?
Lots, actually, so you might need to cut me off at some point. And some of them have come up from what both the panel members have already said, actually. But, you know, we've touched on the need to not just inform, but to remind people about the policies and the platforms that are available. So if you have a service and you have different means for people to be able to raise concerns, remind them of that. You know, something that's really key as well is you know, the need to have a strategy, a comm strategy behind that in the organisation to remind people periodically. So there really is no excuse, and that should be widened out to, you know, not just employees, but in my opinion, you know, freelance workers and so on, and temporary staff, cleaners, you know, that sort of thing, anyone connected to the organisation. But what is quite useful to manage expectations are things like sharing stories whistleblowing reports that have been made, to dispel the myths, because some of the reasons that people aren't prepared to have their identity revealed or to have contributed is because of the fear, not just of reprisals, but actually what will happen. And we can't underestimate the economic impact at the moment. People are in organisations that are going through redundancies and so on, and so may be fearful that that will have an impact on them being selected. So really trying to separate out the negative aspects and the terminal outcomes of reports, and actually show some success stories where they can, and show how the organisation embraces an increase in reports rather than that being seen as a problem. But I think in terms of managing expectations of reporters as well, what's really, really key is certainly differentiating between what is a whistleblowing report and a grievance that should be dealt with by HR. And also the fact that, depending on the gravity of the matter, it may well be that a report needs to be escalated to the police and or to regulators and or any other authorities. So being upfront about that initially, so that the reporter knows that that escalation may happen. It doesn't necessarily mean that my identity will be revealed, but that escalation will happen. And then I think that the other issue is that in terms of the potential outcomes, being clear that disciplinary action could follow. That may be the accused, it may be other parties, but sometimes as well that, certainly in terms of kicking off an investigation, it may be necessary to suspend people, and that isn't necessarily an indicator of guilt or an assumption of guilt. It may just be to protect the integrity of an investigation. It may be to protect the witnesses that may be involved and the evidence. So, being really clear that there may be some outcomes. And I think the other thing in terms of managing expectations is the time scale. So often when I'm called in to support organisations on this, and, from the past, reporters seem to think that this can be something that's dealt with in a couple of weeks. So being really clear and depending on the gravity of the matter, it could take, several months. So being clear about the timescales. And then I think there's actually, something in terms of managing the expectations of their duty of confidentiality as well. They need to protect the integrity of the investigation. And that, like I say, parallel HR processes may end up being triggered through this report, but also parallel HR processes, such as I've mentioned already, if an organisation is going through redundancies, that may happen. And you as a reporter may actually be somebody who's part of that, and it's nothing to do with the report that you've made. The business has to carry on with business as usual, so being really clear about that as well.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tina. And I just want to just add in one thing to say that World Whistleblowers Day is coming up on the 23rd of June, and that's a great opportunity for employers to engage with staff on speak up or whistleblowing, however the terms used. And it's a really good opportunity to hold events or kind of mark that and kind of spread that kind of awareness. But Tim, you've got very politely have your hand up, which I like. Did you want to have something to add? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, just to come in support of what Tina was saying there, we see some very, very good practice from organisations, and we work with some organisations that kind of wrap their initial communication with a whistleblower up in not a formal contract, but they lay out quite clearly what's going to happen, timescales, and really importantly at the end, that you may not be able to tell the whistleblower all the details of a disciplinary investigation, for example, because other people in that process have rights that have to be respected as well. And to try, whistleblowers can get very, very invested in the issues that they raise, and you really have to try and manage manage that side of things as well. I see a lot of policies that I would suggest the timescales are too short, because over-promising and under-delivering is a key way to get another complaint. You know, as a former investigator, you know, it's a great way to get a complaint is by not getting your investigation completed within the time that you've said you're going to do it. And some of that can be mitigated, for example, through the use of platforms and other communication methods. If you say you're going to get in touch with them every month, even just to say a type of holding statement, we'll make sure that you do it. And the more you can shape the expectation at the outset, the better chance you have at the end of having a satisfied whistleblower. Because a satisfied whistleblower, going back to something that was said earlier on, is a great communication tool culturally for the rest of the workplace to know that the system works. There's an old boss of mine used to say, you know, if you get something wrong as an assassin, you need to be the good advocate 7 times to make up for the one time that you get it badly wrong. So the more you can get that in at the beginning, I think that the better fitted you are going forward to have a really trustworthy system.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That ongoing communications really is such a key point. Andy, unless there's something you want to add, I can move on to the next question. So before we sort of answer the many questions that so far been put through the Q&A of the panel members, I just want to ask a final question of you, Andy. Are we now seeing anonymous reporting being the default means of raising concerns?
Yeah, so I'll talk about NatWest, because that's the one that I know most about. Actually, the answer is no. It's the reverse for us. So we are seeing more and more people disclose their identity, reporting kind of confidentiality rather than being anonymous coming through the system. So our anonymity rate is around about, for last year, was around about 57%. But that trend is declining all of the time. So more and more people are disclosing. And probably important to link that into, and the number of reports going up. So it's not that, you know, our rates are getting better, but nobody's reporting. Our report numbers are going up. So that tells me that we seem to be doing some things right. There's always room for improvement, obviously, with these things, but the trend's going in the right way. And then the obvious question to me then would be, well, why is that the case? That's a hard one to answer, but it kind of plays into some of the things that we've already been talking about. So we've been putting quite a lot of work into our kind of comms activity, so focusing on getting people to understand what the framework's about, use of advocate stories. They are the most powerful stories you can use. And we know that through the research that we've done, is that if people can hear from their colleagues and their colleagues are saying, this is a really good experience, I'm so glad I did it and had a great outcome, that's key. I'd suggest don't focus on the nature of the allegation that was raised. That doesn't matter. It's about the experience of the person using the system. And also we've been focusing on things like myth busting, you know. So there's a question, I think it was saying, you know, well, am I truly going to be anonymous? Because actually you're going to track anyway. Even if I go it through the IT system, you're going to track my IP address and you're going to know that it's me that's raised. And it's kind of getting over that and explaining why that isn't the case and how it truly is anonymous if you wish to, you know, remain anonymous. So those things are really important. The other thing that we've been doing that's quite important is being open and honest about the effectiveness of your arrangement. So we share benchmarking activities. So obviously there's various benchmarking tools out there. Protect, you run a benchmarking tool, which we use on a regular basis. And share that with your colleagues. Tell them, you know, how you're doing against the benchmarking, you know, be transparent with them, and maybe even the actions that you're taking to further enhance your processes. That's very important. And the other thing just to finish on is myth busting, in that I think there's a perception out there that if you raise concerns or get anonymous concerns coming in, the substantiation rate is going to be less for them than it is for people that disclose. We did a piece of work probably a couple of years ago now to look into this, and there was no difference in terms of the outcomes for anonymous versus confidential open reporting. So, I think there's a few things there that just may be worth looking at from individuals, organisations, and not making an assumption, because one of the other assumptions that could be made is that people are anonymous because they're really fearful, they don't want their identity disclosed, it's going to be harmful. Within our service, we ask people why they've chosen to remain anonymous. And of course, a lot of people do say fear of retaliation, etc. But some say is, I just don't want to be bothered. I'm telling you that you've got a problem. I'm giving you the problem. I'm not interested in knowing any more about it, but you need to go and sort this out. So there are various reasons why people choose to remain anonymous. It isn't always because they're fearful.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. That's really interesting, especially asking the reasons why somebody might be choosing to go down that path of anonymous concerns. I feel that's a really good question to ask and to get that kind of insight. Tina or Tim, is there anything you want to add to what Andy said or to that answer? If not, I can move to the questions. Great. So the first question I have from the audience is from Christine McFarland. So thank you very much for putting this question. We find that our HR colleagues are keen to understand who the concern has come from so that formal process can begin. We will protect the person's ID. How would you approach this request? So an easy question to start with. Who wants to sort of start off?
Yeah, I'm happy to
go for it, Tina. Thank you.
For that one. And obviously I have to confirm my bias here towards HR being of the profession, but we also have the issue of senior managers and execs who are also wanting to know the details or content of reports that are made. And I think that Andy was veering onto there some really important differentiations between what makes the grievance and the whistleblowing case that I touched on earlier, because if you have a direct personal interest and it's about your individual treatment or experience, then that is where it borders into a HR matter and or a grievance. If it's a case of an org-wide issue and you're in that position where you just say I don't want to be bothered with it anymore, then that's where we can see it more as a speak up and whistleblowing concern. Where HR obviously does have to get involved is where there are implications for how people are being managed. And so it's quite reasonable that if you want action to be taken, then the right department needs to be alerted. However, that does mean that HR therefore have an interest in all of the reports that are made and all of the details. And I think it's quite important to have a governance process for the whistleblowing process in the workplace. So essentially a flow chart of who gets involved and at what point. And it's quite reasonable to say that we can make a generic report to the relevant department. So we can remove the identity, we can talk about the trends and the insights in that way. So certainly the governance of that is really key. And I think that the thing that has to be reinforced, whether it's to HR or to senior managers, senior leadership team, or the board, is that not only a conflict of interest potentially on a matter that you might be dealing with, because for example a report could be about how someone's not had the right kinds of reactions from the HR team, but actually you may be part of that complaint, and so we need to protect that and really take it forward. So I think the reinforcement of protecting the integrity of the process needs to be made, and the organisation needs to take a firm position on that. And we therefore, in order to do that, and we touched on this earlier, have to be really clear who's dealing with what at what time. And that's why that flow chart and that systemic process, and then some governance of it in terms of let's make sure that there's an oversight group that represents all parts of the organisation. So, there are different entities within the organisations, at different levels of people, and that governance group can have oversight. And therefore, for example, if there's a member of the senior leadership team there, if there's a member of the HR team there, then that's covered in terms of what do we need to know and when.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Andy. I think my advice to most people would be that the general answer is no, you can't know who the whistleblower is. We would never reveal it, even if we were working for somebody as august as Andy's organisation. Would lose the business before we would reveal a whistleblower's identity. But we're a bit different because we're in the middle of the process. We're not the organisation that's on the receiving end of the complaint. But I would just encourage people to try and get back to use systems and processes that enable you to communicate back over to the whistleblower, because if you're going to give a whistleblower some confidence about the manner in which that report's going to be handled, who's going to handle that report, that it will be somebody independent, and that's not just Tim's mate's going to look after it. It's going to be somebody very senior to Tim, or somebody from a different district or a different part of the organisation. Then that can go somewhere to turn an anonymous whistleblower into a named whistleblower, and somebody who's more able to assist any kind of investigation going forward.
Just to echo that point on independence there as well. Sorry to jump in, Andy. It was the point about clarifying what you mean by independent investigation as well, because so often I'm seeing with organisations that the understanding of who is an independent investigator or what is an independent investigation hasn't been made, and then the reporter is feeling quite aggrieved as to who's been allocated that investigation.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just to add, I mean, the guide itself does deal with that kind of issue where senior managers who have an expectation of a level of detail and knowledge of what's going on in the organisation, a case study of where a senior manager was trying to find out the details of a whistleblowing situation and how to resist that, and how that's really important. Just to emphasise that sort of point, I think is really important.
Just on that very last point, because I know you want to move on, but just on that,
go for it.
I haven't ever been asked from a senior person who was doing, but I mean, I always position these things anyway, even before I'm asked, is that it protects senior management and directors, because the less they know, the more likely it is that we can defend an allegation that they took inappropriate action because somebody whistleblew. So I think there's some protection element in here for people in the organisation as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point, I think, in terms of sort of safeguarding different parts of the organisation, really, and why that kind of confidentiality is really kind of serves everybody's purpose to a certain extent. So I'm going to move on to another question here, which is from an anonymous attendee, which is sort of fitting because it's about anonymity. But anyway, can a whistleblower's report ever be completely anonymous, and is anonymity given only to the reporter to investigate? Sometimes the report needs to be shared with others in the organisation. Should we go ahead with only after confirming with the reporter? This makes it difficult when the reporter is unwilling to have a dialogue. So
I'm happy to jump in quickly with the starter, and then people. So the simple answer is yes. Somebody can be completely anonymous, and we deal with it all of the time. So I should say that we have a secure communication system that we run. So if somebody raises a concern, they can be completely anonymous. There's no way of us knowing who they are. We wouldn't really want to anyway. And we have undertaken any number of investigations from start to finish, have come out with sometimes disciplinary action, sometimes change in policy, processes, procedures, and we never know who that person is that's raised a concern, and we've communicated with them and they've had a good experience. So it definitely can. There are circumstances, obviously, where somebody wishes to remain anonymous, but probably going back to the first point is that when you're going through your risk assessment and you're going through investigation, it is obvious that we can't confirm that they're going to remain anonymous because of the nature of the investigation being concerns being raised, any other manner of different things. And I think in that circumstance, you need to be open and honest and transparent with a person if you're in communication with them, to explain the situation, explain the risks, and then talk to them and work with them about what the opportunities are to mitigate the risk, right? Because it is a partnership here to a degree. You can't just go off and do what you think without engaging with the reporter. If you don't have that communication route open to you, again, a risk assessment will say whether, actually we can't go ahead with this because we now know who the person is, even though they don't know whether we know, we think it's too risky to go ahead. You have to balance that out with what is it that they're reporting, because if what they're reporting is so serious that something has to happen, then that's got to be a risk-based decision.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, and I think one of the things that came out through the research for the confidentiality guide was it did feel that the level of engagement, I think it's been hit on quite a few different times, different ways, the level of engagement with the whistleblower, rather than the kind of whether you know who that individual is or whether they're anonymous, whether it's through like a communication platform, is kind of key. That level of engagement and the ability to kind of get that information is really important. And just from a whistleblowing point of view, because obviously Protect runs an advice line for whistleblowers, anonymous disclosures can be very difficult to prove if it comes to the employment tribunal. So it can actually be detrimental for a whistleblower who has been victimized or dismissed for their job for blowing the whistle if the employer guesses who they are, because you have to prove you've really made that disclosure a protected disclosure. That's how the Act defines it. And it's very difficult to do that if nobody knows effectively who you are, if you're truly anonymous. So yeah, thanks, Andy, for that. Tina, do you want to come in on this question?
Yeah, so just a point to very quickly add, which touches onto the questions in the Q&As. So there's someone talking about being in a very small company, and so probably doesn't have the resource to outsource this or to pay a separate organisation, and also someone who's talking about getting started, and certainly not just for those that are getting started, but I've been aware of organisations where you can report your concerns to an SLT. You can report your concerns to HR. So, that in itself is a barrier, and particularly would, want to bring around that concern about confidentiality. So, certainly one of the things I would recommend someone to look at in getting this set up is to have a platform where someone can, and it could be an online, on your intranet, on your website, having a form that they can fill in online to be able to do that, rather than them having to use their own individual email. And of course, you would hope that somebody would know that they can create an anonymous email address, so that you can engage with them. But certainly just give people the options of being able to submit the information to you in what can be seen as a confidential way without revealing their email and or identity.
Yeah, so it doesn't have to be necessarily an outsourced kind of product. It can be sort of practical means that people can go through. But also, so the organisation's just aware that anonymous concerns can come through, so the organisation's prepared. You don't have to be a massive organisation also to kind of think about those things and put training in place if that's needed, and have named contacts who have responsibility for those type of arrangements. That's kind of really key. Because Andy or Tim, do you want to come in on the sort of small organisation point or that Tina just raised?
Yeah, we deal with a lot of smaller organisations. That by no means are they all people who have thousands and thousands of staff spread everywhere. Increasingly smaller organisations, I think, are seeing the value in having a proper, as part of an ethics and compliance process, having some kind of proper speak up service. And our usual arrangement, for example, and it's no different from anybody else's, is like, as you said yourself, Andy, you'd have a named person so that a whistleblower can be confident that their issue is going to be managed at a level sufficiently aware from the source of their concern. Obviously, that's harder in a smaller organisation. And unfortunately, that's just the nature of you know, if you're working in somewhere where there's only 20 or 30 people, you're not going to have an HR department and a legal team and an ethics compliance non-executive director, which is where the likes of yourselves come in being able to provide people with the advice and guidance that they need, especially in those kind of limited, difficult circumstances.
Great. Okay, so I've also got a question here just to round off the session, I think, from Daniel Murray, just asking about how to approach, I'll summarize the question, but how to approach situations where concerns are raised in very small teams of 2 or 3 people. So how would you approach the sort of interviewing witnesses for the case? Because it's likely managers might be able to guess from that situation.
I can speak to this from, bear in mind that I am in a really large organisation, but we do have small branches. Yep. So just a couple of things. The first one is that we sort of refer to it as hide in plain sight, but it's where, you know, if one person in the branch raises a concern, obviously what you don't do is go into the branch with your investigation team, interview 3 people and high five the 4th one as you go out, right? So you treat all of them the same. If you're interviewing the subjects or witnesses for 30 minutes, you will interview the reporter for 30 minutes too. It's kind of basic things such as that. But depending on the nature of the concern as well, you don't necessarily have to go in and interview. It depends on what the concerns are. If you can get desk-based information out that will prove or disprove the allegations being raised, then we will try to do that in circumstances where there is a risk of the reporter, you know, being identified. So again, I do realise that I'm in a bigger organisation, so it's, if we were to do comms reviews, so pulling emails, you know, office communicator, that kind of thing, if the allegation allows that type of work, then quite often actually we don't need to go in and interview anybody, because we've got enough evidence to either confirm or deny what's happening remotely.
Fantastic. Great. So we've got a couple more minutes. Does anybody want to chime in on that final sort of question?
Yeah, I'd just like to add that, you know, we shouldn't shy away from the fact that we are taking action when reports are made. So, you know, investigating something is a reasonable response, and, you know, is what we're actually talking about. So, you know, I appreciate that Daniel was raising the issue of, in a small team, you know, they may be able to work out who the reporter was, but actually balance that with the appearance of not taking action and not taking it seriously. You know, you can do interviews discreetly. You know, it's not, you know, barging into a premises and, you know, holding up your badge and saying, let's do an interview now. You know, that these things can be done discreetly and confidentially, but certainly, you know, the matter may be a wide concern. You know, there may be that one reporter, but it could be a concern that's shared by the team as well. And in fact, you know, those other team members are wanting to talk about the same issue. So, you know, I don't think that we need to be hiding or, you know, concealing the fact that we're undertaking an investigation all the time. You know, it's doing it with discretion.
Great. Thank you very much. And I think as we're now getting to 2 o'clock, I think I'm going to draw the session to a close. Thank you very much for attending, you know, lovely audience, and also the panels who have been expert and brilliant comments and answering lots of questions, difficult ones. Anyway, so yeah, thank you very much, and please buy the guide if this is at all something that you would be interested in and you feel your organisation would benefit. So thank you very much. Thank you.